The fluorescent lights of the courtroom hummed, a dull counterpoint to the frantic drumming of my fingers against the worn mahogany of the table. My lawyer, a young man named David Miller with a perpetually worried crease in his forehead, leaned in. "Mr. Thompson," he whispered, his voice tight with nerves. "Are you sure about this? We could still reach a settlement." I fixed him with a look I'd honed over decades of engineering complex projects, a look that said, calculations complete, tolerances checked, no room for error. "Settlement?" I asked, my voice a low rumble. "They stole my peace. They stole my home. They stole my family vacation to Hawaii. They thought I was a senile old fool, ripe for the picking." David shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his tie. "Mr. Thompson, while I understand your frustration doesn't even begin to cover it." "Son," I interrupted, the memory of Melissa's saccharine smile as she explained why I wasn't up for the trip still burning in my gut. "I planned that vacation. I paid for that vacation, and then they had the gall to exclude me, telling me I was too old, too frail to enjoy the very paradise I dreamt of sharing with them. A family trip turned sour on a father's generosity is met with betrayal." He opened his mouth to speak again, but I held up a hand. "Let's just get this over with." The bailiff called the court to order, the familiar words echoing through the cavernous room. Judge Morales, the stern woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, entered and took her seat. I watched Melissa and my son, Robert, enter the courtroom, their faces a mixture of defiance and apprehension. They sat at the opposite table, avoiding my gaze. "Thompson versus Thompson," Judge Morales announced, her voice crisp and clear. "This case concerns a dispute over ownership of a property located at." She recited the address of my home, the home I built with my own two hands, brick by brick, a lifetime ago. The home where I raised Robert, where Eleanor and I shared so many happy years. The lawyer representing Melissa and Robert, a slick, expensively dressed man named Mr. Caldwell, rose to his feet. "Your Honor, this case is a simple misunderstanding. My clients, Mr. and Mrs. Robert Thompson, have been caring for Mr. Edward Thompson, their elderly father and father-in-law, for several years now. They simply wanted to ensure his comfort and well-being." He paused, flashing a practiced smile. "They acted out of love and concern, nothing more. Love and concern." I snorted, a sound that echoed in the hushed courtroom. "They took advantage of me. They convinced me in my grief after Eleanor's passing that it would be best to sign over the house to them, ensuring they could care for me in my old age." My voice cracked with emotion. "Care? They isolated me. They controlled my finances. They treated me like a burden." David nudged me gently, a reminder to remain calm. I took a deep breath, trying to rein in the anger that threatened to consume me. Mr. Caldwell smoothly countered, "Your Honor, Mr. Thompson is experiencing some confusion. He willingly signed the documents transferring ownership of the property. Willingly." I wanted to leap across the table and grab him by the collar. I was vulnerable. I was grieving. They preyed on my weakness. My gaze locked with Melissa's. She quickly looked away. Guilt, I saw a flicker of it in her eyes. It wasn't enough. The proceedings dragged on, a tedious back and forth of legal jargon and carefully crafted arguments. David presented my case methodically, highlighting the financial irregularities, the isolation I endured, the blatant disregard for my wishes. Mr. Caldwell in turn, painted a picture of a loving family caring for a confused old man, a man whose memory was failing him. Mr. Thompson, Caldwell asked during cross-examination, his voice dripping with condescension, do you recall signing these documents? He held up a thick stack of papers, the documents transferring ownership of your home, your son, and daughter-in-law. I looked at the papers, a familiar wave of nausea rising in my stomach. I remember signing papers, I admitted, my voice trembling slightly, but I didn't understand what I was signing. They told me it was for my own good, Caldwell smirked. So you admit you signed the documents? Yes, but no further questions, Your Honor. He interrupted, his tone triumphant. I felt a pang of despair. Was this it? Was I going to lose everything? My home, my memories, the last vestiges of the life I had built with Eleanor. David leaned in, his brow furrowed. Mr. Thompson, I know this is difficult, but we need something concrete, something to prove they coerced you. Do you have anything, any evidence? I closed my eyes, trying to think. They had been so careful, so meticulous in their manipulation. They thought they had covered their tracks, but they had underestimated me. They had underestimated an old engineer's attention to detail. A memory flickered in my mind, a seemingly insignificant detail. The day they had presented me with the papers, Melissa had insisted I use a specific pen, a new pen she had just purchased. She had said it was lucky. At the time, I hadn't thought anything of it, but now my eyes snapped open. The pen, I whisper, my voice barely audible. The pen she made me use. David looked at me, confused. The pen? What about it? I leaned closer, my heart pounding with a sudden surge of hope. The pen, it had a hidden camera. The aroma, pipe tobacco, and lemon oil hung heavy in the air. A familiar comfort in my father's den. Sunlight, fractured by the leaded glass windows, painted kaleidoscopic patterns on the Persian rug where I sat, cross-legged, meticulously assembling a model airplane. I was 10, maybe 11. My younger brother, Charles, for years my junior, zoomed a tow fire truck across the same rug, oblivious to my painstaking efforts. Careful, Charles, I muttered, shielding the delicate fuselage. You'll knock it over. He ignored me, the siren of his truck wailing like a banshee. My father, a stern but generally fair man, looked up from his newspaper. Charles, he said, his voice calm but authoritative, let Edward work in peace. Charles, momentarily subdued, parked his fire truck beside me and watched with feigned interest. What you're making? A Corsair, I reply, proud of the intricate details. It's a fighter plane. He reached out a grubby finger towards the propeller. Can I touch it? No, I snapped, pulling the model away. You'll break it, he pouted, his lower lip trembling. But I want to see. Before I could retort, my mother, Eleanor, entered the den, her hands filled with freshly baked cookies. Here you go, my little violets, she said, setting a plate on a low table. Oatmeal raisin, your favorite. Charles scrambled to his feet, reaching for a cookie. I, however, remained focused on my model, carefully applying a tiny decal to the tail fin. Edward, my mother said softly, come have a cookie in a minute. I mumbled, my concentration unbroken. She sighed, a sound I would come to recognize over the years as a prelude to disappointment. She picked up a cookie and offered it to me. Come on, sweetheart. You've been working so hard. I reluctantly set down the model and took the cookie, giving her a cursory thank you. As I nibbled on the edge, My mother turned her attention to Charles, who had already devoured 2 cookies and was reaching for a third. "Charles," she said, her voice laced with a sweetness that always irritated me, "don't eat them all at once. Save some for later." Charles, of course, ignored her, stuffing the third cookie into his mouth with a satisfied grunt. My mother simply chuckled and ruffled his hair. Later that evening, after Charles had finally tired of his toes and gone to bed, my father called me into the den. He was sitting in his armchair, a book open in his lap. "Edward," he said, his voice grave, "I have something for you." He reached into the drawer of his desk and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden box. My heart pounded in my chest. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. My father was a skilled woodworker, and I had long admired the beautiful boxes he created. "I had been hoping you would make one for me." He handed me the box, and I ran my fingers over the smooth, polished surface. It was even more beautiful than I had imagined. "It's as amazing," I stammered, my voice thick with emotion. "I'm glad you like it," he said, a rare smile playing on his lips. "I made it especially for you." I opened the box, expecting to find a special treasure inside, perhaps a rare coin or a beautiful piece of jewelry. But the box was empty. Confused, I looked up at my father. "There's nothing in it." "Not yet," he said, his smile widening. "This box is for you to fill. It's a place to keep your most precious possessions. The things that truly matter." I nodded, still slightly bewildered, but thrilled nonetheless. This was more than just a box. It was a symbol of his love and approval. The next morning, I rushed downstairs, eager to show Charles my new treasure. I found him in the kitchen, sitting at the table, devouring a plate of pancakes. "Look what Dad made for me," I said, proudly displaying the wooden box. Charles glanced at it with disinterest. "So it's special?" I insisted. "It's for my most precious possessions," he shrugged. Big deal. Just then, my mother entered the kitchen, carrying a small, brightly wrapped package. "Happy birthday, Charles," she exclaimed, handing him the gift. Charles ripped off the wrapping paper, revealing a shiny electric train set. His eyes widened in delight. "Wow," he shouted, jumping up and down. "A train. Thanks, Mom." My mother beamed. "You're welcome, sweetheart." I stood there, holding my empty wooden box, a knot of resentment forming in my stomach. Charles hadn't even asked for a train set. He had received countless gifts for no reason at all, while I, who had worked hard, who had been patient and obedient, received an empty box. A symbol, my father had called it. A symbol of what? Of his indifference, of his favoritism towards my younger brother. The resentment festered, growing stronger with each passing year. Charles, the charming, carefree younger son, always seemed to get everything he wanted, while I, the dutiful, responsible older son, was left to make do with the scraps. The wooden box remained empty, a constant reminder of the unfairness that had permeated my childhood. It became a repository not for precious possessions, but for the bitter memories of a love that always seemed to belong to someone else. This seemingly insignificant incident, the empty box, and the extravagant train set, became a defining moment in my life, shaping my perception of family, of fairness, and of the precarious nature of love. Even now, decades later, the memory of that day, the sting of that perceived slight, remains as sharp and painful as a freshly inflicted wound. It laid the foundation for a lifetime of observing, calculating, and ultimately understanding the true nature of the people closest to me, especially Charles, and, later, his wife, Melissa. They may have thought they were entitled to everything, but I knew better. I had learned early on that life wasn't always fair, and sometimes you had to take what you deserved. The Hawaiian shirts hung in my closet, still crisp in their packaging. Eleanor had picked them out, bright floral patterns that I wouldn't have chosen myself. But she insisted they were essential for the islands. "You'll blend right in, Edward," she'd said, her eyes twinkling. A regular Hawaiian gent. I remember smiling at her then, the anticipation of the trip bubbling inside me. It was supposed to be a family celebration, my retirement gift to myself and to them, to Melissa and my son, Charles. A lavish 2-week stay in a beachfront villa, all expenses paid. I had pored over brochures, researched excursions, imagined us all together, laughing on the beach, making memories. Now the shirts felt like a cruel joke. The vibrant colors mocked me, a painful reminder of what I'd lost. Not just the trip, not just the money, but something far more precious, the illusion of family unity. I sat heavily on the edge of the bed, the phone still clutched in my hand, its cool plastic a stark contrast to the burning shame in my chest. "What?" Eleanor's voice, sharp with disbelief, cut through the quiet of the bedroom. I repeated, my voice hollow. "He canceled the flight. Said he couldn't afford the extra baggage fees." Eleanor sat beside me, her hand finding mine. Her touch, usually so comforting, felt alien. I could feel her confusion, her hurt mirroring my own. "Baggage fees, Edward, you paid for everything. The flights, the villa, even their spending money." "I know," I said, the word catching in my throat. He said Melissa needed new luggage and clothes. Apparently, what I had provided wasn't sufficient. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words. We both knew the truth. They hadn't needed new luggage. They hadn't needed new clothes. They just didn't want me there. I closed my eyes, the imagined scenes of Hawaiian sunsets replaced by the harsh reality of my son's rejection. I had spent my life providing for my family, working tirelessly as an engineer, sacrificing my own desires for theirs. I'd always believed in the sanctity of family, in the unspoken bond that tied us together. But that bond, it seemed, was more fragile than I'd ever imagined. Eleanor squeezed my hand, her voice soft. "He'll call back, Edward, he'll explain." I shook my head, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "No, Eleanor, he won't. He's made his choice." The Hawaiian shirts seemed to taunt me from the closet, their bright colors a stark contrast to the grayness that had settled over my heart. I stood up, walked over to the closet, and began taking them off the hangers one by one. The crisp material felt like sandpaper against my skin. "What are you doing?" Eleanor asked, her voice laced with concern. "Putting these away," I reply, folding each shirt carefully and placing it in a drawer. "They won't be needed." Eleanor watched me, her eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored my own. We didn't speak again for a long time. The silence in the room was heavy, punctuated only by the rustling of the shirts as I folded them and put them away, a ritualistic burial of a dream. I remember staring at the closed drawer, the vibrant patterns hidden from view, and feeling a strange sense of detachment. It wasn't just the trip I was mourning. It was the loss of something more profound, the shattering of a belief system I had clung to for so long, the belief that family, above all else, would always be there. The days that followed were a blur. I went through the motions, eating, sleeping, going for walks, but a part of me felt hollowed out. I avoided speaking to Charles, unable to face the hurt and the anger that simmered beneath the surface. Eleanor tried to mediate, to bridge the gap that had opened between us, but her efforts were futile. The wound was too deep, the betrayal too raw. I found myself spending hours in my study, surrounded by my books and my blueprints, the tangible remnants of a life I understood, a life I had built with my own two hands. The world outside, the world of family and emotions, felt chaotic and unpredictable. But here, in my study, surrounded by the logic of engineering, I found a semblance of peace. I started going through old photographs, tracing the trajectory of our lives, from the early days of our marriage, to the birth of Charles, to his graduation, his wedding. In each photograph, I saw a different version of myself, a younger, more hopeful version. I saw a father who believed in the unwavering love of his son, a father who would have given anything for his family's happiness. Looking at those photographs, I felt a pang of regret, not for what I had done, but for what I hadn't seen. The subtle shifts in Charles's demeanor, the increasing influence of Melissa, the gradual erosion of our bond. I had been so blinded by my own desire for a close-knit family that I had failed to recognize the cracks that were forming beneath the surface. One evening, while sorting through a box of old papers, I came across a letter I had written to Charles years ago, when he was just a boy. It was a simple letter, expressing my pride in him, my hopes for his future. I remembered writing it with such heartfelt emotion, pouring all my love and aspirations for him onto the page. Reading it now, years later, the words felt hollow, almost meaningless. The father who had written that letter no longer existed. He had been replaced by a man who felt betrayed and disillusioned, a man who was struggling to reconcile the image of the son he had loved with the reality of the man he had become. I folded the letter and put it back in the box, the weight of it pressing down on me like a physical burden. The Hawaiian shirts remained in the drawer, a constant reminder of the trip that never was, of the family that had fractured beyond repair. The betrayal, the humiliation, it was a wound that would likely never fully heal. But in the quiet of my study, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, I began to formulate a plan to reclaim what I had lost, not just the money, not just the trip, but something far more important, my dignity. And in the silence of that room, a new resolve began to take root, a quiet determination that would ultimately shape the course of our lives. The stale courtroom air hung heavy, thick with the perfume of Melissa's cloying floral scent, and the faint, metallic tang of my own anxiety. My knuckles, white against the worn mahogany of the witness stand, throbbed with a dull ache. Melissa, perched on the edge of her seat like a preening peacock, shot me a triumphant smirk. Her lawyer, a slick character named Mr. Henderson, adjusted his tie and paced before me like a circling shark. Mr. Thompson, Henderson's voice dripped with condescension, you've testified that you willingly gifted your house to your daughter-in-law. Melissa, correct, I did, I replied, my voice a raspy whisper, the words catching in my throat like dry leaves. The light tasted bitter, like ash. And you claim that this gift was conditional upon your continued residence within the property. Yes, my gaze locked with Melissa's. Her smirk widened. She thought she had won. She thought she had me cornered, trapped like a rat in her meticulously crafted cage. Yet Henderson continued, his voice rising in volume. You have presented no documentation, no contract, no witnesses to corroborate this claim. Am I correct?" He paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air, punctuated only by the rhythmic tap-tap-tapping of the court stenographer's fingers on her keyboard. I swallowed hard, the dryness in my throat intensifying. "Objection, Your Honor. My own lawyer, a young, earnest woman named Miss Davis," interjected Mr. "Thompson is about to present such evidence." Henderson scoffed. "Oh, really?" After weeks of this charade, Mr. Thompson suddenly produces a rabbit out of his hat. Judge Miller, a stern-faced woman with eyes that could bore through steel, looked at me expectantly. "Mr. Thompson, do you have evidence to support your claim?" My heart pounded against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. This was it, the moment of truth, the culmination of weeks of planning, of carefully laid groundwork, of sleepless nights spent replaying every conversation, every interaction, every betrayal. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "I do, Your Honor." My voice, though still shaky, held a newfound strength. Melissa's smirk faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. Henderson's confident stride stuttered, his eyes narrowing. "And what, pray tell, is this miraculous evidence?" he sneered. I reached into my jacket pocket, my fingers trembling slightly as I retrieved a small, unassuming flash drive. It held within it the key to my freedom, the proof of my meticulous planning, the instrument of my long-awaited revenge. "This, Mr. Henderson," I said, holding the flash drive aloft, "contains recordings of every conversation I've had with Melissa and my son, Robert, regarding the house. Every promise, every assurance, every lie." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Melissa's face drained of color, her carefully constructed facade crumbling like a sandcastle in a storm. Henderson's jaw slackened, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Objection," he sputtered, regaining his composure. "This evidence is inadmissible. It was obtained illegally." Miss Davis stood her ground. "Your Honor, the recordings were made in Mr. Thompson's own home, a place where he had a reasonable expectation of privacy. They are perfectly admissible." The judge considered for a moment, her expression inscrutable. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. "Objection overruled," she finally declared. "The evidence will be admitted." A wave of relief washed over me, so profound it almost buckled my knees. I glanced at Melissa, her face a mask of shock and anger. The smirk was gone, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated fear. It was a look I had longed to see, a look that fueled the quiet fire that had been burning within me for months. Henderson, flustered and off balance, stammered through a series of weak objections, all of which were swiftly overruled by the judge. He knew he was beaten. The air had been sucked out of his sails, leaving him adrift in a sea of his own making. The court clerk inserted the flash drive into a laptop, and the first recording began to play. It was my voice, clear and steady, outlining the terms of the agreement with Melissa and Robert. Their voices followed, echoing their promises to allow me to live in the house for the remainder of my days. As the recordings played, a sense of calm settled over me. The anger, the frustration, the betrayal, all of it began to recede, replaced by a quiet sense of satisfaction. I had played the long game, and I had won. The recordings continued, each one a nail in the coffin of Melissa's carefully constructed lies. Her promises, her assurances, her manipulative tactics all laid bare for the court to hear. The courtroom was silent, save for the sound of my own voice echoing through the speakers. I watched as Melissa's face contorted in a mixture of anger and despair. She knew she had been caught, that her carefully crafted web of deceit had been unraveled. The look of fear in her eyes intensified, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something else: regret. The final recording ended, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Judge Miller looked at Melissa, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "Ms. Thompson," she said, her voice cold and impartial, "do you have anything to say in your defense?" Melissa opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She just sat there, defeated, the weight of her own lies crushing her. This wasn't the end, not yet, but the tide had turned. I had exposed their betrayal, and now it was time for justice to be served. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I would finally reclaim what was rightfully mine: my home, my legacy, my peace of mind. The first crucial battle was won. The courtroom hummed with hushed whispers. Sunlight streamed through the tall arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. I adjusted my tie, the knot feeling tighter than usual. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drummer keeping time with the ticking clock on the wall. "All rise," the bailiff called, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. Judge Mallory entered, her face impassive, her gaze sweeping over the courtroom. I met her eyes for a brief moment, and a strange calm washed over me. This was it, the culmination of months of planning, of meticulous strategizing, of swallowed pride. "Be seated," she instructed, and the rustling of fabric filled the brief silence that followed. My lawyer, Mr. Henderson, a young man with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind, gave me a reassuring nod. Across from us sat Melissa and my son, Robert, their faces etched with a mixture of anxiety and defiance. I could almost taste the bitterness in the air. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Mallory addressed me, "are you ready to proceed?" "Yes, Your Honor," I replied, my voice steady, stronger than I expected. I had rehearsed this moment countless times in my mind, picturing this scene, the expressions on their faces, the weight of my words hanging in the air. "And the defense?" Judge Mallory turned her attention to Melissa and Robert. Melissa's lawyer, a portly man named Mr. Davis, stood and adjusted his glasses. He had an oily smile that always rubbed me the wrong way. "Ready, Your Honor," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. The trial had been a grueling affair, a public airing of family grievances and betrayals. Melissa and Robert had argued that I was mentally unfit, that my decision to revoke their access to my finances and reclaim my house was a product of senility and paranoia. They painted a picture of a doddering old man, clinging to his possessions, unwilling to share his wealth with his family. It was a cruel and calculated fabrication, and it stung more than I cared to admit. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Mallory began, "the court has reviewed the evidence presented, including the financial records and the testimonies of both parties." My grip tightened on the armrest of my chair. "This was it. The evidence clearly demonstrates," she continued, her voice ringing with authority, "that Mr. Thompson was of sound mind when he made the decisions regarding his finances and property. Furthermore," she paused, her gaze fixed on Melissa and Robert, "there is no evidence to support the claim that Mr. Thompson was unduly influenced or coerced." A wave of relief washed over me. so potent it almost brought me to my knees. I glanced at Eleanor, my dear wife, sitting beside me. Her hand was clasped tightly in mine, her eyes shining with ancient tears. She squeezed my hand, a silent message of support and shared victory. Therefore, Judge Mallory concluded the court rules in favor of Mr. Edward Thompson. The ownership of the property reverts back to him, and the previous financial arrangements are hereby nullified. The gavel slammed down, the sound echoing in the hushed courtroom. It was a sound of finality, of justice served. Melissa and Robert sat stunned, their faces pale. Mr. Davis sputtered in protest, but Judge Mallory silenced him with a raised hand. But this wasn't the end. I had one more card to play. "Your Honor," I said, my voice now clear and strong, "before we adjourn, I'd like to submit one final piece of evidence, Mr." Henderson looked at me, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. I had not told him about this. I wanted it to be a complete surprise, not just for Melissa and Robert, but for everyone in the courtroom. I reached into my briefcase and retrieved a sealed envelope. I handed it to Mr. Henderson, who in turn passed it to the bailiff. Judge Mallory opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. It was a letter written in my own hand many years ago, addressed to my late son, David, Robert's older brother. As Judge Mallory read the letter aloud, the color drained from Melissa's face. The letter detailed a specific provision in my will, a clause that stipulated that if Robert or his spouse ever attempted to manipulate or exploit me for financial gain, they would be entirely disinherited. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with tension. The words of the letter hung in the air, a damning indictment of Melissa's greed and Robert's complicity. The Hawaiian vacation, the constant pressure for financial assistance, the fabricated claims of my mental instability all pointed to a calculated plan to wrest control of my assets. This letter, Judge Mallory stated, her voice resonating with quiet authority, clearly outlines Mr. Thompson's intentions. Given the evidence presented during the trial, it is the court's opinion that the conditions outlined in this letter have been met. She looked directly at Melissa and Robert. Therefore, she continued, the court upholds the provisions of Mr. Thompson's will. Robert and Melissa are hereby disinherited. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Melissa gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Robert stared straight ahead, his face ashen. Their carefully constructed world had crumbled around them, leaving them exposed and defeated. I felt a profound sense of satisfaction, not from the victory itself, but from the knowledge that justice had been served. I had protected my legacy, the hard-earned fruits of my labor. More importantly, I had honored the memory of my son, David, whose kindness and integrity had been so cruelly exploited by his own brother and sister-in-law. As I rose to leave the courtroom, Eleanor's hand firmly in mine, I looked back at Melissa and Robert one last time. Their faces were masks of shock and disbelief. They had underestimated me, dismissed me as a senile old man. They had learned a valuable lesson that day, a lesson about the enduring power of truth and the quiet strength of a father's love. The vacation they so desperately craved had cost them far more than a trip to Hawaii. It had cost them their inheritance, their reputation, and their relationship with the man who had once loved them like his own children. The silence that followed them out of the courtroom was the silence of a legacy of ambition finally silenced.